Well, hello, good morning, good day, good evening, wherever you're joining in from, and welcome to today's Data Plus Women Germany event. We are talking today about how to do no harm with data viz, but before we delve right in, I'll say a few words about the initiative. So, hi, my name is Heidi Kalbe. I'm a Tableau ambassador and senior consultant at Woodmark Consulting. I founded Data Plus Women Germany in late 2019 as part of the global initiative. I was recently joined, like a couple of months back by now, by my co-lead Lea Zimmer. Who are we as Data Plus Women Germany? Data Plus Women is an initiative aiming to offer women a community all around their work in data. We want to help people share their knowledge and experiences and to celebrate their successes as well, of course. The initiative has originated within the Tableau community, but it is open to people from all backgrounds. As such, we are not just about women. We are aimed at people of all genders because we are all united under one common goal of advancing diversity in the data community. We aim to offer a platform to all minorities, whether that be gender or age or language or ethnicity or academical background or any other kind you can imagine. We want to help people find a secure foothold in the world of data, to build a network and to discover new opportunities. Again, as always, Emily Kuhn said it best 2 years ago when she said, it's data plus women, it's not data minus men. So again, welcome, and what have we planned for you today? We are joined today by our guest speaker, Alice Fang, who will talk about how to do no harm with data viz. After her talk, you will have the opportunity to ask all the questions you can imagine, so please make liberal use of the Q&A feature, which you can find probably somewhere at the bottom, so make sure to check that out. And also feel free to connect with other attendees using the chat feature. After the Q&A, I will announce our upcoming events, and as always, please feel free to stick around for some networking. So with that, I'll say a few words about Alice. Alice is a data viz developer based in the Washington, D.C. area, and she's very passionate about using design to make data and information more accessible to broader audiences. She has recently been exploring ways to bring more diversity, equity, and inclusion into the way we visualize data. Her work has appeared in the Parametric Press and The Pudding, so if you follow either of those, you will probably find her work there. Previously, Alice has worked as a data viz developer at the Urban Institute, where she built both interactive and static data visualization features and tools communicating public policy research. Currently, she's embarking on a new adventure at Natera as a senior data scientist. If you want, please feel free to reach out to Alice using Twitter. You will find her at FleeceAlice. And with that, over to you, Alice.
All right. Well, thank you, Heidi. Let me get my screen share going. Okay, so hopefully you all see my slides.
Yeah, looking good.
Okay, great. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. As Heidi mentioned, my name is Alice Feng, and I'm a data visualization developer based in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm really excited to speak with you all about some work I've been doing with my colleague, John Schwabish, over the past year that looks at how we can do no harm with data viz by making sure our charts and maps are created and designed with a diverse, equitable, and inclusive, or DEI lens in mind. My talk today is a summary of our longer report, the Do No Harm Guide, which is a resource for how data visualizers and communicators can apply an equity lens to their work. But first, why is this important? Why should we care about whether or not our charts and graphs embrace DEI? Well, some might say that the purpose of data viz is to amplify the impact of our data, to make the patterns or insights in our data more accessible to more people. Therefore, if how we visualize and communicate our data does not reflect diversity, equity, and inclusion, I would argue that our graphs have the potential to amplify harm. And unfortunately, data viz has been used in the past with harmful impacts. This here is a map produced in 1937 by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency tasked with appraising home values in neighborhoods across the US. They created color-coded maps of every metro area in the nation, with the safest neighborhoods colored green and the riskiest in red. Now, neighborhoods that were considered risky were risky because they were predominantly African American and Latino. These maps were used in turn to deny families of color from receiving mortgages to buy homes with, and is where the term redlining comes from. So here we have an example of an explicitly racist data visualization that definitely perpetuated harm, as can be seen by the continued wealth gap between white families and families of color that persists in the US even to today. Now, this map was made in 1937. Unfortunately, offensive charts are still being made today. This chart appeared last year and made the rounds on social media. It is an icon chart showing average female height for 6 different countries. There are, well, quite a few problems with this chart. From data viz principles, the data here are improperly encoded. We have a y-axis that doesn't begin at 0, and the icons are scaled by area instead of by height only. This distorts our perceptions of the data values and exaggerates the differences in average female height. But from a DEI perspective, this chart is also problematic because it reinforces gender stereotypes. A chart about women uses icons that are rendered in shades of pink, and all of the icons are wearing dresses. So unsurprisingly, people were offended by this chart. This tweet from Saba Ibrahim, an educator and environmental campaigner, reads, "As an Indian woman, I can confirm that too much of my time is spent hiding behind a rock, praying the terrifying gang of international giant ladies and their Latvian general don't find me." So even though this chart probably wasn't meant to be explicitly sexist, it still had a harmful impact. Therefore, what I want to talk about today is how can we make sure that our data visualizations don't perpetuate harm? And if I were to sum this up in one word, I would say it all comes down to empathy. Applying a DEI lens to how we visualize and communicate our data requires empathizing with both the communities whose data we are visualizing, as well as the readers and target audiences we are communicating to. This quote from the journalist Kim Bui is a good rule of thumb to think about when you visualize data. As you make decisions on the design of your charts and graphs, ask yourself, if I were one of the data points on this data visualization, would I feel offended? In this presentation, I'm going to offer some thoughts, mostly framed as questions, for you to consider. I want to make it clear, though, that there are, with just a few exceptions, no hard and fast rules here. No right answers or wrong answers. I'm not going to be telling you, always do this and never do that. Instead, I want people to be thoughtful when making decisions. Don't just act on autopilot or mindlessly follow defaults or do things just because that's how it's always been done. Know why you chose what you did. Know why you made the decisions that you made. 2 last notes. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about will be framed in terms of race or gender, but all of these principles apply to other aspects of identity, including age, sexuality, class, ability, etc., and their intersectionality. Also, much of my talk is going to be from an American perspective, but I really welcome hearing about how issues of equity are framed in other countries. So let's talk about how we can visualize data in ways that demonstrate empathy. First off is the language that we use in our charts. Research shows that titles, text, and labels are the first things readers scan when encountering a chart, and therefore are really important for showing empathy. So ask yourself, do my title, annotations, notes, etc., explicitly mention forces of oppression and historical context? So to elaborate on what I mean by this, I'm going to walk you through an example taken from the book Data Feminism by Catherine D'Ignacio and Lauren Klein. Here we have a bar chart showing the share of people by race receiving a diagnosis of mental illness while in jail. The title and subtitle read, Mental Health in Jail, Rate of Mental Health Diagnosis of Inmates. Now, this title seems neutral and objective. It feels like it accurately describes the data that we are showing. But the authors argue it ignores the role racism and discrimination play in how likely people are to receive a diagnosis of mental illness in jail, even though the study this data are taken from finds convincing evidence that discrimination does play a role here. Also, notice how the subtitle uses the word inmates, a pretty dehumanizing term that focuses on people's crimes and punishments. We'll get back to this in a little bit. So, dissatisfied with the original title and subtitle, the authors come up with a new version that reads, Racism in Jail, People of Color Less Likely to Get Mental Health Diagnosis. Now, in this version, racism is explicitly named as a force of oppression at work here, and offers a frame for how to interpret the numbers shown in this chart. Also, notice that inmate has been replaced with people in the subtitle, since we are talking about actual people who are in jail. However, the authors still take issue with the new subtitle. By only talking about people of color, they fear they might offer a deficit narrative that focuses on what this group is lacking or missing and fails to portray them with creativity and agency. Also, by only mentioning people of color, it can make it seem like race is an issue for people of color only. So the authors offer one more version of the chart, keeping the title from the last iteration, but changing the subtitle to White People Get More Mental Health Diagnoses. The new subtitle focuses on the unfair advantages that are given to the dominant group, here, white people in jail, rather than what marginalized groups lack. It avoids propagating a deficit narrative that reinforces negative associations and stereotypes, and calls out that white people have a race and that they derive an unfair advantage from their race in this particular situation. More importantly, this title and subtitle provides readers with a context for interpreting the numbers they are seeing in this chart that is grounded in the conclusions of the original research. So I hope you can see from this example what an important role things like titles play in providing context and framing that allows users to correctly understand the data you are showing in your chart. The only thing the authors changed here are the title and subtitle. The data hasn't changed. It's the exact same bar chart. But the different ways the titles are written really alters our understanding of what's happening here with mental health diagnoses in jails. Now, I noted in the previous example how the authors disliked the word inmate in the original subtitle of the chart because they felt it was dehumanizing. On that note, it's also important to ask if our labels are using people-first language. For example, people in jail instead of inmate, or people with disabilities instead of disabled. Remember, data are not just some sterile abstraction. They reflect the lives and experiences of real people, and as such, it's important to communicate that humanity to your audience. This dashboard shows an example of when language was used that was not people first. It presents a series of bivariate choropleth maps showing the share of individuals in poverty by race. The screenshot here only captures the first map, but there are two others in this dashboard showing data on white people and Latino people as well. Now, if we zoom in on the legend, we see that the author has written the labels as more Black and more poverty. These labels might seem like a very succinct and accurate way to describe the data that we're showing, but they don't embrace a DEI lens. Black refers to skin color, not people. And poverty is an experience, not an identity. Possible better ways to label this legend might be larger proportion of Black people and larger proportion of people experiencing poverty. I should note that the author did later change more Black to larger Black population. Another question we should ask ourselves when it comes to language is, do my labels reflect the terms the community I'm visualizing prefer? Language is always evolving. Terms that were socially acceptable a generation ago are no longer in favor today. And new terms are always appearing. For example, Latine versus Latinx versus Latina, Latina. Therefore, it's important to check with the communities you are researching or with your target audience for how they would prefer to be identified and to use those terms in your visualizations. Now let's talk about ordering data purposefully. What I mean here is things like the order of the bars in a bar chart or the order of the rows in a table. The main question asked here is, which group am I presenting first and why? Who we present first affects how readers perceive the relationship or hierarchy between groups. Always starting with white people or men, for example, makes it seem like these groups are the default against which other groups should be compared, and that they are the most important populations. Who we show first can also reflect who we view as the main audience we are trying to communicate with. Now, there is a historical precedent for why we often see white people or men appear first in charts. This is a portion of the survey used in the decennial census from the US Bureau of the Census. It asks, what is person one's race? The first option, respondent C, is white. The next option is Black or African American, then American Indian or Alaska Native, followed by multiple options for Asians and Pacific Islanders, and finally, some other race. This is how the question about race appears in another major US demographic survey, the Survey of Consumer Finances from the Federal Reserve Board. Again, the first option here is white, and it's even encoded in the data with the number 1. This is how the panel study of income dynamics from the University of Michigan asks about race. Again, we see that white is the first option and is encoded in the data as 1. And finally, one more example. This is from the Census Bureau's current population survey and how it asks about race. You probably all have guessed by now, white appears first among the selection options and is encoded as 1. So as we saw, all of these major demographic surveys list white as the first option for race. So ask yourself, which group am I presenting first and why? And if your answer is that you don't have an answer, or this was the order the data came in and you just went with that, ask yourself, can my results be ordered differently? It's important to not just default to the way the data were given to you. Here are some ideas for alternative ways to order your data. First, does my study focus on a specific community? If so, you should probably show their results first. Is there a particular story or argument I'm trying to tell? So, make sure that your order reflects that story or argument. And is there a quantitative relationship, for example, population size or effect size, that exists between groups? Can they be ordered alphabetically? And sometimes after asking these questions, you may find that the right thing to do is to show white people or men first. That's fine. Again, the critical takeaway here is not never start with men or white people, but to consciously make a decision and know why you made that decision. Next, let's talk about considering the missing groups. It is also important to acknowledge who is and is not included in our data and charts. How many times have we seen charts that show data on white people, Black people, and Hispanic or Latino people, but not any other racial or ethnic groups? Or charts that include only men and women and ignore other gender identities. Or maps of the US, which don't include any of the territories. Why do we not show these other groups? And what is the impact of not showing them? These are important things for us to be aware of and think about. Sometimes groups can be missing because no data are collected about these groups or topics. Mimi Onuoha's The Library of Missing Datasets is an art installation that consists of file cabinets full of empty folders labeled with topics that no data are being collected on, even though they are important issues that you think someone would be interested in. Some examples are poverty and employment statistics that include people who are behind bars, Muslim mosques and communities surveyed by the FBI or CIA, mobility for older adults with physical disabilities or cognitive impairments, LGBT older adults discriminated against in housing. The point of showing all these empty file folders is what the artist states here. That which we ignore reveals more than what we give our attention due. Spots that we've left blank reveal our hidden social biases and indifferences. Groups whose data are and are not collected or shown often reflects who society deems as most important or valuable. So ask yourself, who is missing from my data visualization? Does my data visualization acknowledge groups or communities that are missing? Now, sometimes we do have data about certain groups, but we choose not to display them due to sample size concerns or statistical insignificance. In this case, it's important to ask ourselves how we should handle this situation. The data tool, What Coronavirus Job Losses Reveal About Racism in America, from ProPublica, shows one possible approach. In this data tool, users can select different demographic characteristics. Here, race, gender, age, education level, and income level, and see how the unemployment rate has changed pre and post the start of the COVID-19 pandemic for that particular population. However, some selections can result in quite small sample sizes. For example, the one seen here, Native American men without a high school degree. Rather than exclude this group by removing them as an option that users can select, ProPublica displays a message over the chart, informing the reader how the lack of sufficient data for this population would result in estimates that are too imprecise to be reliable. This approach allowed ProPublica to be inclusive while not misinforming its readers. Another question we should ask ourselves when it comes to missing groups is how can we, as data analysts and visualizers, challenge organizations conducting surveys to be more inclusive? Just because it may be harder to obtain data about certain groups doesn't mean we shouldn't still try to better understand their lives. Next, let's talk about choosing colors and icons with sensitivity and inclusiveness. The main question asked here is, do my colors and icons avoid reinforcing stereotypes and power hierarchies? In terms of colors, don't use colors that reflect gender stereotypes. For example, pink and blue for women and men. We also want to avoid using colors that symbolize skin tones. For example, representing African Americans with black or Asians with yellow. Similarly, make sure your icons reflect the diversity of the world we live in and don't reinforce stereotypes. These are the results you get if you do a Google image search for the phrase nurse icon. Over half of the results here present a woman as a nurse. In particular, I want you to notice the image in the bottom left corner. It shows 3 doctors, all of whom are men, and the one woman who is shown is the nurse. On the other hand, these are the results you get if you do a Google image search for the phrase boss icon. The overwhelming majority of the results here show a man. Clearly, these icons reflect a bias we have when it comes to who we think of as being a nurse or being a boss. Another question we want to ask ourselves is, do my icons and images show people as empowered and dignified rather than as helpless victims? I'm sure we've all seen quote unquote poverty porn images of emaciated children in developing countries. Never use images that exploit people and shows them at their weakest and most vulnerable. Instead, choose images that reinforce people's dignity, agency, and humanity. Now, it can be hard to catch all the ways in which icons and images depict problematic stereotypes. So try to solicit feedback about the visuals you're using to make sure that they are not offensive. Finally, let's talk about embracing context and complexity. For those of you who are familiar with the field of data visualization, you've probably heard of this term, the data ink ratio. It's this concept that charts should show the data as much as possible and nothing but the data. That charts should be as spare and minimal as possible, and any sort of decoration or ornamentation are bad. But is this idea of a high data ink ratio actually a good thing? Is this really the right philosophy for us to embrace? We should ask ourselves, does my design accurately reflect and promote a better understanding of the topic being shown? Does my chart acknowledge the context and history of this topic? Visualizations should not let the data speak for themselves. Data, especially data collected about human beings, are not neutral or objective. Therefore, visualizations that use this data are not neutral either. We need to mention factors such as structural racism or historic discrimination and other barriers and inequities that play a role in the phenomena we are visualizing, just as we saw in that example earlier with the bar charts of mental health diagnoses in jail. Furthermore, many social issues have an inherent complexity that cannot be boiled down to a simple bar chart or line chart. And we as data visualizers are doing a real disservice when we try to do that. Data viz should be clear and informative, while not oversimplifying the complex world that we live in. Perhaps another question we should ask is, if I only saw this chart on Twitter, would I draw the correct conclusion? And taking this one step further, we might even want to ask ourselves, do I even need to make this chart? Sarah Slobin, formerly a graphics editor at the Wall Street Journal, wrote about her experience working on a story about families with children who have a fatal disease. Sarah and her team were given data about a severity index, which tracks the progression of the disease. So naturally, they immediately tried to find a way to visualize this data. But after spending months trying to understand the index and the data underlying it, brainstorming and sketching all sorts of ways to visualize this data, the team realized nothing was sticking. None of the visualizations they had created seemed right. And after struggling to find a compelling way to visualize these data and the children that were affected by it, Sarah and her team realized that charts were not necessary after all, and that simply showing photos of the children diagnosed with these fatal diseases was sufficient, perhaps even more compelling. As Sarah writes, when you looked at the kids, really looked at them, you understood what the data was capturing, how the disease progressed, what it wrought. And you saw these beautiful little people, and you understood what the severity index was all about without a chart or a visualization or an explainer. So sometimes you don't need a chart. Sometimes there are better ways to convey empathy. As I wrap up this presentation, I do want to take a step back to acknowledge the entire data ecosystem and how data viz is one part of this larger process and can't be viewed in isolation from these other issues. You can't have DEI in data viz if DEI isn't baked into the entire project. If the data and analysis underlying your visualization are biased or flawed, using people-first language or choosing the right colors for your chart won't magically fix these problems. So in my remaining time, I want to touch on just a couple of issues. That of research methods, or how we're doing our research, data collection, and the composition of teams and organizations working with data. As we go about conducting our research, we should think about how we can engage with people's lived experiences and how we can do so in a way that benefits everyone. So ask yourself, did my project seek out and engage with community partners to help me better understand the topic I'm studying? Is the community seeing benefits from the work I'm doing? Do my goals align with theirs? Were community members given an opportunity to weigh in on the design of the project? And were final results shared with the community first before publication so they could provide feedback? Not every project will be able to do all of the things listed here, but we should still strive to do so as much as possible. Research and analysis should be done with communities, not on behalf of them. After all, they are the experts on their lives, and we should seek to learn from that. Another really important point is to critically examine the data we are using in our charts and maps. Just as trying to analyze flawed data generates flawed results, trying to visualize flawed data will also generate misleading and deceptive charts. When thinking about DEI issues specifically, we should check our data for ways that they might be biased or the product of racist or oppressive data collection systems. Now, this is a really big topic that is beyond the scope of today's talk, so I'll leave you with these questions as a starting point. Ask yourself, how were these data generated? Are these data representative? Who is included and who is excluded from these data? Whose voices, lives, and experiences are missing? Why were these data collected? Who stands to benefit? And who might be harmed by the collection or publication of these data? And finally, it's important that data teams and organizations also embody diversity and inclusivity. Diverse teams can help identify biases and make connections between different fields of study whose relevance may not be evident at first glance. They can also better reflect the demographics of the population they wish to study. It's hard to make data viz, that is DEI, if the individuals and organizations making them do not themselves embody and embrace a spirit of DEI. Therefore, it's important to be aware of your identity and how that affects the biases you hold. So ask yourself, what is my identity as an individual? What are the identities held in my team? And what is the identity of my organization? As I conclude this presentation, I want to again reiterate that the ideas I have laid out here are just a starting point and will certainly change and evolve as society and technology changes and evolves. But in an increasingly multicultural world, we can't afford to ignore DEI issues in the ways we work with and visualize or communicate data. Building inclusive tools and visualizations can make the experience better for everyone. Everybody benefits when we treat people with respect and empathy. So I want to thank you all again for giving me this chance to speak. I hope that what I presented here today helps all of us work with and visualize data in ways that do no harm. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Alice. That was super informative. Many new insights for me as well. Many things to think about more consciously. I really enjoyed the example at the beginning of the differently sized women icons. I think that was really colorful. So we don't have any questions from the audience yet. So I just want to remind everyone to please make liberal use of the Q&A feature. But I do have a couple questions.
Sure.
So you already mentioned that you mentioned a couple of hints for like how to be better at data collection, but how can we cope with more historical data sets that simply don't have the data?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I also fully acknowledge that a lot of times people who focus on data viz, data communication, we're like at the very end of the process, right? We're very removed from how the data itself was collected or generated. And I'm certainly no expert in survey design or data collection systems. I would say in the case of historical data sets, it's important to do your homework. Learn as much as you can about those data sets. What are their shortcomings? What are their biases or flaws? You're probably not the first person to have realized that there are certain issues with some of these historical data sets. So read up on what other people have uncovered and acknowledge that as best as you can in your work, in the way you present your data. Just be very upfront about these caveats and why you are using this data set, even in spite of some of these drawbacks. Maybe that is the only source that you have that you can work with. And so in that situation, just be honest about what are these flaws, and if you can mitigate them, but at the very least just disclose that there are these issues, these problems with these data sets, and we are aware of that, I think is at least a good first step.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you. A lot of the tips you gave us were for us as creators of data visualization, but what about consumers? Like, do we need to sensitize consumers so that they are like more open to consuming more inclusive data viz, or will they simply run with it?
Oh yeah, that's a really, really interesting question from the data consumer side. I guess a part of me feels that at the very least, the more that we as the data visualization community produce work that does embrace these principles of diversity, equity, inclusivity, just the fact that more people are going to be more exposed to this kind of work, I hope will eventually lead to, people, if not like openly and enthusiastically embracing this and feeling like that, yes, this is the way data always should be, analyzed and presented. At least kind of getting used to it, accepting it, right? I mean, we have to be realistic that there are always people who are just, no matter how hard we try to reach out to, they're just going to be, well, more resistant to change, to embracing different ideas. But hopefully just the fact that we keep making more work that embodies these ideas, at least will normalize that this is the way that data should be researched, presented, visualized.
Yeah, I like that. I think especially with like a lot of stereotypical ways of visualizing data, like talking about color, blue for men and red for women, right? I guess it's a lot like the stereotype persists because it's just what we're used to. If we try to use alternatives, like I think it was Lisa Charlotte Rost who suggested using, I think, green for men and purple for women as like mentioning like the suffragette period in the UK. The more we use that, the more normalized it will become, I guess.
Right. Yeah. I hope so.
All right, we do have a question from Julia. So Germany has a line in the constitution of the country: nobody should have disadvantages because of race. There is a discussion to replace the word race with nobody should be racially disadvantaged. The pro argument is that race is a construct and not relevant anymore. But the against argument is, if we don't say race, it is getting harder to talk about racism and to talk about it as a problem. Do you have an opinion on that?
Oh, yeah, that's really, really interesting. Yeah, and of course, I'm not familiar with how issues of racial inequities present themselves in Germany. I think, to me, I think I'd fall on the side of it's important to explicitly acknowledge and name, things like race or other aspects of identity that have led to inequities and disparities in society. I understand where people who want to be like, we're colorblind, right? Race doesn't matter anymore. Or the more that we talk about race, the more we are trying to oppress people. I see where they're coming from. I am very skeptical, I guess, of that viewpoint. I think the fact is that these issues do exist. You can look at a lot of research and analysis and data that show that, unfortunately, different groups do experience different outcomes certainly in American society on a variety of dimensions. And so the fact is that, these inequities mean that we as a society should do something. And the only way we can know if we're making any progress is to acknowledge things like race and be able to measure that. But I think ultimately, even if we existed in a society where there were no more racial disparities, everybody had equal opportunities and equal outcomes. Diversity is a great thing. I think it really strengthens the world that we live in. The fact that people have differences in who they are, their life experiences, the way they view and perceive the world. And I think it just adds so much to our lives when we get to encounter and communicate, exchange dialogue. That I think it's better to, rather than try to ignore differences or view everybody as being the same, to acknowledge that there are differences, and that can be a wonderful thing that really adds a lot to the richness of our world. So that was
yeah, I like that. I like that. Thank you.
Database, but
yeah. Okay, so we have one more question, which is also a bit beside the point of data viz, but you mentioned like if we as creators are not like part of the group who we're trying to represent for data visualization, that can be kind of difficult. We do need to reach out to the community, but also like I guess at some point people from minorities will get tired of having to explain racism to white people, etc. So like how can dominant groups use resources to better understand problems that they may be inadvertently like perpetuating? Like how do you have any resources or any good articles or anything that, for example, explains sexism to white men or something like that?
Ooh, yeah. I'm so bad at remembering specific titles. I definitely have read great things that I would recommend. I know like The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander Cass. Some of those books have been really, really good for like the racism, the sexism side. There was a book I read recently. Its exact name escapes me, but it's about how the world really is designed for men, right? Like all the measurements that we take as the default human, height, width, like body mass is based off of a man, and therefore results in products that are not well designed for women and can be ultimately dangerous, put women's lives at risk.
Invisible Women?
It might be that one. That sounds right.
Might be
sounds
that
like
one,
yeah. So yeah, I would say that definitely it's incumbent on all of us to take that initiative, right? Be curious, be humble, be willing to learn, whether that is books, articles, there are organizations doing online trainings and resources too. Talk to other people, talk to your coworkers, talk to your neighbors who have different identities, different experiences. So yeah, it's definitely on us all of us to take the initiative to educate ourselves as much as possible. But at the same time, I want to also acknowledge that it's a big learning curve, and the space it really is always changing, and there's always new issues being uncovered. And so I think it's almost inevitable that all of us at some point or another are going to just miss something, right? And not out of a place of like intentional malice, but just that there's very little limit to how much any one of us can be a full expert on all the issues surrounding identity or diversity. And therefore just be open to messing up, being open to, when you find out that you've done something wrong, fix it, learn from it. And as much as possible, I think, organizations definitely have a role to play in this too, building systems or processes that kind of help us identify those omissions, those biases that we don't realize we have. Like, as I mentioned, right, things like getting feedback from other people is definitely a good step towards helping you realize when you inadvertently picked an inappropriate image or used language that maybe was not the best fitting. So I think it's definitely a role that all of us have to play. All of us as individuals have to take ownership, but I think definitely, larger organizations and the cultures that we're in can also help set up an environment that also encourages all of us to be more aware of and to hopefully learn from and be better at being champions of DEI.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, so we don't have any other questions at this moment. So again, thank you. I want to share with everyone our upcoming events because we do have a couple planned that are going to happen soon. So our next event will be in a couple of weeks. So I think that's week after next. On Thursday, December 16th, we are celebrating our Global Data Plus Women Holiday Special. So Data Plus Women Germany is banding together with Data Plus Women Zurich and Netherlands and Latin America and maybe another one I'm forgetting. Anyway, lots of Data Plus Women local chapters are coming together to celebrate the holidays with you. And we will have two fantastic speakers. So we are hosting Shelby Waklu and Julia Büchting, and you can RSVP under the link below. That will be our final event for 2021, but fear not. We, of course, have our first events for 2022 planned as well. So if you don't have any plans for next year yet, these will be your first two events to join. We are kicking off January on Tuesday, January 25th, where we will be hosting Ruth Dreyer, and she will talk about the mental load. And then again in February, we are hosting our friendly initiative Coffee Code Break. So we are inviting a couple ladies from Coffee Code Break who will be talking about their different careers in data and how mentoring and being mentored has helped them, my apologies, find their foothold in the data community. So I hope to see all of you there, and most importantly, hope to see you at our holiday special. All right. So with that, again, thank you so much, Alice. I would like to invite everyone to join us for a round of informal networking. I will be stopping the recording in just another minute. And if you have to drop out, I'll see you hopefully at our holiday event. Thank you all for joining us today. Again, thank you, Alice. It has been a real joy, really informative. And have a lovely evening, everyone.